All right, welcome back. So today we transition to the discussion of free will, whether or not you have it. And what we're going to do today is look at a handful of arguments that strongly suggest that you lack it, that everything you do is unavoidable. And then, like last week, second lecture, we're going to try and pick apart those arguments. Few things by way of reminder. So the big thing is that you've got an assessment task due in a week. This assessment task is accessible to you now on Moodle. Just click on the thing that says Assessment Task 1.1. And you'll be able to see the questions there. There's one on time travel. There's one on free will, if I remember correctly. And these are just slightly different than the assessment tasks you did in semester 1 of philosophy, if you did semester 1 of philosophy. They're a bit longer, but the general expectations are the same. You need to accurately express ideas from the readings and the lectures in your own words. You need to avoid copying course slides. We know what the course slides say. We'll know if you're just pulling language from them. One way of effectively conveying your own understanding has to do with just generating your own examples. So if you're able to apply concepts in a way to new cases, that's a good indicator that you understand the concepts on your own and aren't just able to ape things we've said in slides and readings. So for example, with the grandfather paradox, try expressing the problems there without talking about grandfathers. In fact, the issue of grandfathers and conditions relevant to your own existence are not actually the fundamental problem in the grandfather paradox. So, and your tutors have consultation hours. If you have specific questions you'd like to bounce off them, see them during that time. They're not required to provide written feedback to questions on essays. They just can't possibly provide that for everyone, but they are fully available to you during consultation hours. So have a look at the 8 assessment tasks, and as questions arise, take those to your tutors, either in the tutorial itself or during their hour. Okay, free will. Why don't you just turn to the person now next to you and register your thoughts. Do you think you have free will? Do you not? Do you have any reasons for your inclinations in that regard? Just register your thoughts with each other for a quick moment. All right, that's probably good enough to start. I'm just curious, who thinks we have free will? Want to just raise your hand? Right, and when I ask these questions, I'm just saying, what's your gut reaction now? Right. All right, looks like most of you, and who thinks not? All right. And anyone firmly undecided? Just didn't know which way to go? Couple? All right. Well, today's the day for those of you who think there's no free will. So we're going to give you a handful of arguments for thinking there's not. One of the difficulties with the free will debate is that it's kind of hard to step into really quickly, just because there's a lot of terminology you got to get familiar with. Not terribly much terminology, but we got to spend a few minutes getting clear on some terms, some concepts, so we can have a discussion where we're not just speaking past each other, using terms in different ways. Okay, so there's initially the definitional question, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about free will? Here's one explication of the concept, one that's pretty going to be familiar to anyone who's been reading on the literature. So we'll just read it slowly and just sort of take it in and let this be our operational characterization of free will. All right, so this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It says that to have free will is to have what it takes to act freely. All right, well, it's not quite informative yet, but we're getting there. To have free will is to have what it takes to act freely. When an agent acts freely, when she exercises her free will, it's up to her whether she does one thing or another on that occasion. A plurality of alternatives is open to her, and she determines which she pursues. When she does, she is the ultimate source or origin of her action. All right, so what's this getting at? It's getting at the idea that when we're thinking about free actions, we're thinking about actions emanating from us and our choices in a way that it's true to say you had control over what you did. Right? It's up to you in an important sense. You determined which among the various options were available to you, which to do, and you chose it. And when that happens, you've determined what you've done, and it seems like you've acted freely. Right? That's just the concept. Now, it's one thing to say that, it's one thing to define a concept, right? We could define unicorn, horse-like creature with a horn and magical powers, okay? It's a whole other thing to say that unicorns exist. And it's something else also to specify not just what a unicorn is, but what the world would have to be like, or what kinds of conditions would have to be true in order for there to be unicorns. Same thing with free will. We've characterized it, we've defined it in a way, not, in a broad way. But we want to know whether or not it exists, and we want to know what would the world have to be like in order for there to be free will in the first place. Okay. So to that latter question, that last question, what would the world have to be like, what conditions would have to be satisfied, Richard Taylor provides some answers. So he first of all says that in order for any action of yours to count as a free action, all right, so what kinds of actions have you performed today? Lots, right? You chose to get out of bed at a certain time. You chose to pick up your phone and look at it at a certain time. You chose to have one thing for breakfast rather than another. You chose to put one shoe on before the other. Your morning up to this point has been filled with many, many, many actions. And ordinarily we think that the vast majority of those actions were free. And we're now asking the question, well, what does the world have to be like in order for those actions to actually be free? Well, one, there has to be nothing that prevented you from performing the action, right? This should be obvious, right? If there was something that was preventing you from performing the action, you wouldn't have performed it. If there was something in the world stopping you from putting on the left shoe first, then you wouldn't have put on the left shoe first. Right, so this is utterly trivial. I wouldn't mention it, save for the fact that Taylor mentions it. Right, it's so obvious. Secondly, and somewhat more interestingly, there has to be nothing that constrains you, nothing that forces you, nothing that moves your hand in some sense. All right? The idea is that if you freely put on your left shoe first, it couldn't have been the case that there was, say, a contraption wrapped around your body forcing you to take the left shoe and put it on the left foot and tie it up. Right, there has to have been nothing that forced you to perform the action. Right, again, pretty obvious, not too surprising. Lastly, this further condition has to be satisfied. You could have done otherwise. All right, so if you put the left shoe on first freely, it has to have been true that you could have refrained from putting on the left shoe first. Right, you have to have been able to do otherwise. A lot of the free will debate centers around this last condition. What does it take for it to be true that you could have done otherwise? All right, we'll talk about this more. in lecture today. And you can think about it sort of pictorially, right? If you freely chose to do A, then it has to have been the case that you could have chosen to do something else instead. Right? We'll circle back around to this. Okay. We're not done defining terms. We've got a few more to throw out. But first, let me just highlight two ways in which the free will debate is quite interesting. So first of all, it's interesting because it forces us to sort of ask a question about how we should conceive of ourselves and our behaviors in the world. Should we think of ourselves like puppets, right? Marionettes, controlled by marionettes by strings. If we don't have free will, and if all our actions are in some sense unavoidable, it sure seems as if we're not very different from programmed machines or puppets, right? Our actions aren't really our own. And right, that's very much not how we think of ourselves. That's very much not how we think of each other. When we blame each other, when we hold each other responsible for our actions, we're attributing to each other and to ourselves actions that seem as if they were free and as if the person could have avoided doing them. And that's the second point of connection. There's this moral connection. We punish people for doing things that are egregiously wrong. We exact punishment in a variety of ways, right? If someone offends us deeply, we're not going to invite them to our parties. If someone breaks the law egregiously, we're going to throw them in prison. And this all seems morally correct, right? That some punishments are really deserved by certain kinds of actions. But if our actions are not our own, this practice of holding each other morally accountable seems a bit odd, right? Ordinarily, we won't punish someone if a machine were strapped to their body and they were forced to do some heinous act, right? It was, it wasn't up to them, right? They weren't in control. It was the machine that was controlling them, and whoever put that machine on them that's responsible, not the person themselves. If you lack free will, then it seems like that's much more like our situation, and that our practices of punishment aren't quite as well founded as we typically think. Okay. All right. More terms. All right. Fatalism and determinism. All right, fatalism, just the idea that everything that happens is unavoidable. Okay? Which shoe you put on first, what you had for breakfast, what time you entered this room, which seat you sat down in, what time you will leave, when I will stop speaking, etc. and so forth. Every event is unavoidable. Whatever happens could not have been other than it is. All right, so that obviously implies that for any action you perform, that action's unavoidable. Okay, determinism, different concept. It's first of all the view that everything's caused. Right? This is sometimes known as universal causal determinism. The idea is that there's no action or there's no event that occurs that lacks a cause. And every event that does occur is rendered unavoidable by the conditions in the world that preceded it. Okay. All right, which conditions? Past state of the world plus the laws of nature. All right, so the idea here is that, first of all, a familiar one, our universe operates according to laws. Right? It's not a sheer accident that when you drop a pencil in ordinary circumstances, it falls to the floor rather than going to the ceiling or spinning about and poking you in the eye. There are rules by which physical objects in this world operate. Right? Things just don't behave randomly. There's regularity. The rules or laws of nature specify those regularities. And each event that occurs at a time, so says universal causal determinism, is to be explained in terms of whatever the laws are, plus the preceding state of the world. Right? So if you've got a series of dominoes, and one's falling, universal causal determinism says that whatever happens after the collapse of that one domino is fully fixed by whatever the laws are and whatever the state of the world is. The relevant state of the world is, in this narrow scenario, just the falling of the domino. Right? That's the state. The domino's falling. Whatever happens next is fully fixed by that state and whatever the laws are. And we know what the laws are, at least roughly enough. Things that push other things that aren't fixed, at least in the... All right, so a lot of qualifications would have to be put in here to spell this out generally. But, with the domino scenario, we know that the laws indicate that when the first domino collapses, it's going to cause the second one to collapse, so long as it's the same size as the standing domino is the same size as the falling domino, and there's nothing holding the standing domino up. Are there any questions about these two concepts, fatalism and determinism? All right, does fatalism entail determinism? If fatalism is true, does that mean determinism is true? Why don't you whisper your thoughts to the person next to you? And vice versa. If determinism is true, is fatalism true? Okay? Turn to the person next to you. All right, so does fatalism entail determinism? Can you be a fatalist and reject determinism? All right, let's see if you have clearer thoughts about the other direction. Can you be a determinist and reject fatalism? Or does being a determinist mean you have to be a fatalist? All right, Andy's saying yes to the second question. And that's right. If you're a determinist, then you're a fatalist of a particular sort. Because if you're a determinist, you say everything that happens is caused by the past and the laws of nature. Right? Everything's rendered unavoidable by the past and the laws of nature. Now, if everything's rendered unavoidable by the past and the laws of nature, then everything's unavoidable. That's just fatalism. It just says everything's unavoidable. But notice, fatalism, so you can't be a determinist and not be a fatalist. But you can be a fatalist without being a determinist. You can say that everything that happens is rendered unavoidable, but it's not rendered unavoidable by the past and laws of nature. It's rendered unavoidable by some other thing. Right? You might think maybe God controls all our actions or something. I don't know. Just any alternative explanation you could think of, that's going to be an explanation or a position that allows you to be a fatalist without being a determinist. Okay. Now, the determinist's portrait of the world and the fatalist's portrait of the world, the history of the world, that is, looks a bit like this, or at least it's often depicted like this, just the straight line. That is, there's just one way things will be. Right? There's one way things happen to the present, right, the actual history up till now. And then there's how history will be going forward. And if you're a fatalist, then there's just one way things are going to be. Right? The future, whatever it is unavoidable. Right? This is to be contrasted with indeterminism. Right? The indeterminist is someone who rejects determinism. They say determinism's false. And they also reject fatalism. They don't think the future is unavoidable. They think that the future is open. And this idea of openness is pictured by the forking paths. Right? So you can choose when to leave. Right? You're here now. You can leave now. Or you could sit a bit longer and leave then. Or you can sit even longer and leave then. You could sit the whole day in this room if you liked. These are various options. And the indeterminist says that right now you've got a choice. Remain or leave. Well, you're going to remain. What's up? And now you've got another choice. You can remain or leave. Well, you remain. And in an hour or so, you're going to choose to leave. Each point of the fork is a point at which you have a choice. And the indeterminist says the world can go either way. Right? You can stay, you can leave. It's not fixed. All right. Here's a question. Can you have this view of the world? Can you be an indeterminist? Can you think that the future is genuinely open and be a four-dimensionalist? Why don't you turn to the person next to you, register your immediate thoughts. Remember what the four-dimensionalist says. The past, the present, and the future all exist. All right, they're all equally real. All right, so any reactions? Anybody think that it's not possible to hold both views? All right, looks like about half of you, or maybe a third, and that's right. If eternalist four-dimensionalism is true, then the future is fixed. Right? There's a fact of the matter on the eternalist four-dimensionalist view about what time you leave this room. If there's a fact of the matter about what time you leave this room, then there's no alternative way the future could be. That's just how it's going to be. You can see how this might cause trouble for the idea of free will. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now here's interesting variation on the eternalist four-dimensionalist picture. There's a way of being a four-dimensionalist and embracing the forking paths view, the indeterminist picture. This is called Possibilism, and it's the idea that the past and present exist and are equally real, but the future does not yet exist. All right, so we're moving into the future, right? The waves moving forward, and the future is becoming, but does not yet exist. Right? So the future is not real. But the past and the present are. And this is a way of being a four-dimensionalist, and also a way of allowing for at least one direction of time travel. Well, one direction if you're at the cusp of what's becoming. One way of holding a view of time that allows for time travel. Right? Because if you reject both versions of four-dimensionalism and maintain that only the present exists, there's nowhere to go. Okay. Any questions about this? All right. Yeah.
Are we just completely ruling out like the multiverse sort of idea?
Yeah, we are. We're fully setting multiverses aside simply because it changes the topic of the question. We want to know whether or not we can travel to a specific point in our actual past, as opposed, at least when we're discussing time travel, as opposed to asking a question, can we go somewhere that's a whole lot like our past, but isn't strictly speaking our past?
But like in terms of the future sort of thing, like could you say that there were different futures, but they all equally exist?
So that's still not time travel of the sort that raises logical problems. Because there's just not going to be a contradiction in like going to those futures. Yeah, it's cheating with a lot. I mean, it's not perhaps cheating in one sense of cheating, but it avoids illogical problems just by reconceiving of how we're thinking about time travel. But that just leaves us with all the same logical problems when we think about time travel in the ordinary way of revisiting a point in our actual past. And so that's why we set it to the side. It's because it's It's too easy a solution to be worth your time to talk about at length. And there's a way of resolving the really hard problems, which is what we talked about last week. Yeah. All right. Two more terms to wrap your head around. Not too difficult. First is called incompatibilism. This should be easy to remember. It just says that free will and determinism and unavoidability more generally are not compatible. They're not consistent. They can't both be true. Right. So incompatibilism says free will and determinism are not compatible. So if determinism is true, there's no free will. If all your actions are unavoidable, there's no free will on the incompatibilist view. And then lastly, there's a view called libertarianism. And this should also be easy to remember, think liberty, freedom. It's a view that there is free will, and indeterminism is true, as well as incompatibilism. Right, so the libertarian thinks this package of views is correct. Determinism is false. Free will is not compatible with determinism, and we actually have free will. I would wager that most people who begin thinking about the topic of free will start their thinking as libertarians. Right? This is kind of the ordinary view of our place in the world. It's a libertarian view. Now we're going to turn to some challenges. But before we turn to some challenges, do you have any questions about these terms? I hate throwing so many terms out at once, but it helps to have an efficient, non-equivocal conversation. All right, you're good? Looks like you're good. All right, 4 arguments against free will. All right, the first argument is an argument we've already gestured at. It stems from Eternalist Four-Dimensionalism. And the problem is simply this. If the future is just as real as the past and the present, then there's a fact of the matter about what you're going to do. There's a fact of the matter about how you're going to treat your roommate, about how you're going to treat your mom and dad next you see them. There's a fact of the matter about whether or not you finish university on the kind of schedule you've intended. There's a fact of the matter about everything. The future exists. It's there. Now, if the future exists and it's there, then what you will do is already determined. It will be, as it is, because it's already there. It's real. So it sure seems like if the four-dimensionalist picture of the world is correct, you just can't have free will. Right? That's the argument anyway. Any questions about the argument? You see the problem? All right, we can spell out the problem a bit more precisely. Again, I encourage you guys to, as much as possible, try and formulate arguments, at least arguments that are of interest to you, in this kind of way. It really helps to facilitate effective analysis. All right, so here's the argument. All right, if four-dimensionalism is true, eternalist four-dimensionalism, the future already exists, and so all your actions already exist. Four-dimensionalism is true. Therefore, all your actions already exist. And if all your actions already exist, then they're all unavoidable. So all your actions are unavoidable. If all your actions are unavoidable, none of them are free. Right, that's what incompatibilism says. So none of your actions are free. All right, this is what's called a valid argument. We'll talk about this more next week. Just means it's impossible for the premises of this argument to be true and the conclusion false. Right, so you cannot say all the premises are true and reject the conclusion. Strictly speaking, that's a contradiction. It is a logical impossibility. So if you're going to disarm this argument, you've got to fuss with some premise. You have to say some premise is false. All right. So we'll just flag that and put in the back of your mind, well, which one should I Which one should I fuss with? Here's another argument. Suppose eternalist four-dimensionalism is not true. All right? So suppose time travel is not possible. The future does not yet exist. Still, if determinism is true, what do we know? Well, we know this. Every future event is fully determined by the past and the laws of nature. So even though it's not true that the future event exists, I guess from your perspective, the future event, even if it's not true that the future event exists, there's still a fact of the matter about what that future event will be, because the future event is fully determined by past events and the laws of nature. So think about a series of dominoes that are, stood up on end. You knock the first one over, right? It hasn't yet hit the second. If eternalist four-dimensionalism is true, the future event of the second domino falling does not yet exist. Still, if determinism is true, and the laws of nature are as we take them to be, right, such that objects of equal size standing on end, hitting each other, cause each other to fall, right? So long as that's true, and the first one's falling, we know that the second one's going to fall, right? That's just how it's going to be, unless there's something holding the second one up. Now, if all events are like that, as the determinist says, right? The determinist says absolutely every event is like that. It's like the second domino collapsing once the first is pushed. Then how you treat your mom and dad next you see them, how you interact with your roommate, which parties you attend, when you finish university, which shoe you put on first or second, etc. They're all fully determined, like the dominoes collapsing are determined. Right, so all your future actions are rendered unavoidable by the past and the laws of nature. So you can't do otherwise than you will do. And it seems like if you can't do otherwise than you will do, then in what possible sense could you be acting freely when you insult roommate next, or choose to go to that party next, or so on and so forth? Okay. Again, we can state the argument formally. This is just a way of putting what I've already articulated. I'm not going to read this. I'll leave it to you to look at in the slides. Any questions about this argument, though? The informal line of reasoning I've just given you? All right. That's our second argument against free will. It's there. Okay. Knowing the future. A funny thing about knowledge, it can't be wrong. If you know that the second domino is going to fall, then it's going to fall. If you know that you're going to buy a pair of shoes tomorrow, then you're going to buy a pair of shoes tomorrow. If you know that the power set of a set always has more members than the set itself, then that's true. Right? This is called the factivity of knowledge. Right? We'll talk more about this in the last few weeks of class when we talked about epistemology, knowledge, whether or not it's possible. But all epistemologists, or virtually all, agree that it's just a part of the concept of knowledge that if you know something, then it's the case. Right? There's no such thing as false knowledge. So if you know something and you turn out to be wrong, you may have thought you knew, but you were just mistaken. Right? You can't know false things. All right, so now let's think about knowledge of the future. Now let's think about it in the context of an omniscient being, God or something. So suppose in 1916, 100 years ago, there's an omniscient being who exists, and because he or she is omniscient, they know everything. So they know all the facts about the future. They know how the future is going to be. Now, if they know that you are going to attend this lecture today at this time, and since knowledge entails truth, it's true that you would attend this lecture this day at this time. Right? And you couldn't have done otherwise. Right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have known. So if they really had knowledge way back then, then it's guaranteed that you'd be here now. And if it's guaranteed that you'd be here now, then there's a sense in which you couldn't not have been here now, given that it was known that you would be here now. And notice this generalizes to everything. If there's an omniscient being, then they know everything you're going to do. They know the whole history of your life. And so there's not an open, it can't be that you falsify that knowledge, because there's no such thing as false knowledge. So if it's known what you will do at every point in time in your life, then what you do at every point in time in your life is unavoidable. And so it seems as if you can't have free will if there is an omniscient being who knows everything about your future. We don't have to think about this problem in terms of omniscient beings exclusively. It just makes it easy to see that you can't have any any free actions, at least prima facie you can't, if there is such a being, because they know all the facts about the future. But we can think about more limited instances of the problem, right? We know if a parent, right, they've seen their child take the cookie from the cookie jar when forbidden innumerable times. The cookies have been freshly baked. The child's hungry. The parent knows what the child's going to do. Or at least we can conceive of circumstances where the parent will know what the child will do. But if the parent knows what the child will do, right, if it's a genuine state of knowledge, then it's true that the child will do such and so. Right? And they can't, in a sense, avoid the action. But there's all kinds of things a parent wouldn't know about a child's future actions. And so there's going to be options for future free actions, given the lack of omniscience of the parent. Not so with an omniscient being. Okay. Again, we can state this formally. I'm not going to do so. I just want to draw your attention to one assumption. 5, right? Incompatibilism. If your action... So in this example, I talked about raising your hand and that being known in advance. If your action raising your hand was unavoidable, then it was not free. Right, this comes from incompatibilism. And you'll notice this is the third occurrence of this kind of premise in the fatalistic arguments. It occurred in both previous arguments. Okay? All right, the relevance of that will emerge shortly. One last argument. So we've talked in the past about principles of logic, laws of logic. Here are 2, law of excluded middle and non-contradiction. We spent a lot of time with non-contradiction, or at least employing it last week. Didn't talk about excluded middle. Excluded middle just says, for any statement whatsoever, it's either true or it's false. All right, you're in a lecture theater now. That's either true or it's false. You will leave the theater eventually. It's either true or it's false. There's hair on your head. It's either true or... just let any statement whatsoever come to mind. This principle says it has one of 2 truth values. It either has the value true or it has the value false. Okay. Now, let's talk about statements about your future. What you will do tomorrow. What you will do tomorrow morning. What will you do when you see your parents next? What you will do when your roommate inconsiderately uses your sweat. I don't know what, but right. There are all sorts of statements about your future. The law of the excluded middle says they're either true or they're false. The law of non-contradiction says they're not both. Right? So it's either true that you're going to kick your roommate in the shins in a week, or it's false, and it's not both true and false. Okay? Without any omniscient being, we now have reason to think that there's a fact of the matter about all your future actions. Right? Just take any statement whatsoever about your future actions. The law of excluded middle says it's either true or false. The law of non-contradiction says it's not both. And it's true now, whether or not you'll kick your roommate in the shins next week. It's true now, whether or not you will win the lottery. It's true now, whether or not you'll eventually leave this theater. There's a fact of the matter now. Now, if there's a fact of the matter now about what you will do, then it sure seems as if what you will do is unavoidable. And so it seems as if just with logic alone, we've got reason to think your future actions are unavoidable, and so are not free. All right. So problems in paradise. You walked in here, maybe you didn't, but many people walk into discussions of free will for the first time with the ordinary conception, the libertarian conception. Our actions are free actions, at least mostly. We could have chosen to do otherwise in a vast number of cases where we've made choices. I've given you 4 arguments to think that that assumption's false, and to think that therefore libertarianism's not true, and for thinking that your place in the world is much more puppet-like than you ordinarily are inclined to think. Okay. Now let me introduce you to one way of dealing with these problems. Okay. Again, I formulate the argument for you. All right, so here's one way, right? I've given you 4 arguments. Each argument has premises. You got to reject some premise if you're going to avoid the conclusion you lack free will. Okay. We gave you the argument from Eternalist Four-Dimensionalism. Well, one way of dealing with that argument is just to reject Eternalist Four-Dimensionalism. Say that's false and provide reasons for that. You can deal with argument 2 by saying the laws of nature are not deterministic. And that would be a way of disarming the argument, because the presupposition of the argument, a premise of the argument, is that determinism is true. The third argument from an omniscient being, you could say, well, there are no omniscient beings. Well, that's one way of dealing with that problem. And then you could reject a law of logic, okay, to deal with the final problem. Now, the difficulty is that you take on a fairly heavy burden if your defense of free will is going to consist of this strategy, rejecting all 4. Right? That's a lot of work to do, and some of those assumptions are pretty plausible. So this is think of this as the hard route to defending libertarianism, to defending your ordinary thought that I often act freely. That's the hard route. It's a noble route, to be sure, but it's hard. Here's a quick solution. Here's the easy route. It's to reject incompatibilism, or in other words, to accept compatibilism. Remember what incompatibilism says. Free will and the unavoidability of your actions are not compatible. Compatibilism says they are. And in each of the 4 arguments I gave you against thinking your actions are free, there was an incompatibilist assumption. And so one very efficient way of disarming all the arguments is to opt for compatibilism. So let's talk about that. All right. Compatibilism's popular among philosophers. It goes back a long ways. It's popular today. And here's the way to appreciate what it's up to. All right. So they first of all acknowledge that when it comes to having free actions, the non-prevention condition and the non-constraint condition apply. 2 constraints we began with. And they also maintain that you could do otherwise. Now you might think, hey, wait a second. How could that be true? Right? How could it be that all your actions are unavoidable, and yet you could do otherwise whenever you act freely? That sure sounds like a contradiction. All right, so that's the puzzle. Here's how they unravel the puzzle. They provide a way of thinking about the concept of having the ability to do otherwise that's fully consistent with determinism and unavoidability more generally. Let's just sort of motivate it with some ordinary cases, right? Do you think you could hack your mother to death with a machete tomorrow? Right? Now, if you don't love your mother very much, and you're thinking, maybe. Well, think about someone you really care about, someone you really love. Right? Could you perform such a heinous act against them tomorrow? Now, if you're a sane, healthy, moral human being, then you're going to think, no, I couldn't do that. Now, all right, so you can't do that in some important sense. Are you freely able to refrain, given that you've just acknowledged that you can't do that? Well, ordinarily we wouldn't think there's a problem there. I can't do that, and I'm freely going to not do that. Now that thought at least doesn't automatically seem contradictory. And the compatibilist says, that's right. There's an important sense of could have done otherwise that's relevant to having free will that's completely consistent with the unavoidability of your actions. And appreciate there's a lot of actions that are like this. If you really esteem academic integrity, you're going to think, I couldn't possibly decide to cheat on the upcoming exam. Or you'd think, I couldn't possibly kick my roommate in the shins or push them down the stairs. Or I couldn't right? You're going to think there's a lot of actions that just given who you are, you can't do. And you're going to think ordinarily, yeah, that you're freely not doing them. Here's how the compatibilist makes sense of this. All right. They're going to say, it's true that you could have done otherwise, so long as the following condition is satisfied. All right, this is the compatibilist condition. If you had chosen to do otherwise, excuse me, you would have. If you had chosen to do otherwise, you would have. This can be true even if it's also true that your actions are unavoidable. All right, so what's this? This is called a counterfactual claim. Counterfactuals are conditionals, if-then statements that involve would in some way or other. That's a general way of identifying them. And this kind of counterfactual is true just in case, had you made a different choice, you would have performed a different action. Now, it might not be possible that you made a different choice, right? If determinism's true, if fatalism of any sort's true, it's going to be false that you could have made a different choice. The compatibilist says that's okay. What matters is this. If you had made a different choice, even if it's not possible to do so, if you had made a different choice, you would have performed a different action. And so long as that's true, then it's true that you could have done otherwise. All right. Do you get it? Let's think about it this way. You love your mom, suppose. You love your mom. You care a lot about her. You want to see her do well in life. You want to see her live into her old age. You want her to see her grandchildren, etc. You couldn't possibly decide to hack her to pieces tomorrow with a machete. You freely refrain from so heinously murdering your mother, according to this condition, just so long as, if you had chosen to hack her to pieces tomorrow, you would have. Right now you can't. You love your mom too much. You're not going to hack her to pieces tomorrow. But if you had chosen to do so, you would. Right? Happily, you're not going to choose to do so, and you couldn't have chosen to do so. Right? So that's compatibilism. That's the condition they say is important. And if you go compatibilist, you've got a really neat, elegant, quick way of disarming all the fatalistic arguments. Right? You can say, yeah, there's a sense in which everything in the future is unavoidable. But then you get to say, yeah, it doesn't matter for free will. Right? What matters for free will is that my actions stem from my choices in an important sense. And so if I had made different choices, I would have performed different actions. And so long as my actions satisfy this kind of counterfactual condition, they can be free actions. And so you very quickly, efficiently disarm all four objections. There's just a minute or two left. Any reactions? Anything I could clarify? Yeah.
If the omniscient being knows everything, then can he or she have free will?
The omniscient being themselves. All right. So I would think off the top of my head that the omniscient being, knowing everything about what they're going to do, is going to be in the same position as you are, given that they know everything you're going to do. If they know what you're going to do, you're going to do what they know you're going to do. If they know what they themselves are going to do, they're going to do what they know that they themselves will do. And so if there's a problem for free will for you, there's a problem for free will for them. Interesting fact, if compatibilism is true, and we can act freely despite an omniscient being's knowledge of our actions, then they can also act freely given their knowledge of their own actions. Right. Well, I leave you to ruminate on this. We're going to pick up compatibilism next time. We're going to look at some challenges, and we're going to see if there's not another way to deal with these problems. All right, so we're going to do the harder task next time.